Seconds after takeoff, a Boeing 757 carrying 189 passengers and crew is in grave danger. Alarms blare in the cockpit as the three pilots struggle to understand what is happening to their aircraft. The instruments they have been trained to trust are lying to them. And, what's worse, time is running out. With every passing second, their plane is losing speed. If it gets too slow, it will fall out of the sky. Will the pilots be able to diagnose their problem before they lose control of their aircraft? This is a story about how a small inconvenience can snowball into a full-blown emergency. But more importantly, it's a story about the importance of teamwork in the cockpit, especially in crisis. This is the story of Birgenair Flight 301. On the night of February 6, 1996, 176 passengers and 13 crew boarded Birgenair Flight 301 at Puerto Plata in the Dominican Republic. They were bound for Frankfurt in Germany, with stopovers in Gander in Canada and Berlin. Almost all of the passengers were German holidaymakers returning home from a package holiday in the Caribbean, though there were also 9 Poles on board, including 2 members of the Polish Parliament. In the cockpit on this night were 3 Turkish pilots. The captain was 62-year-old Ahmet Erdem. He was highly experienced, having built up over 24,000 hours of flying time in a wide array of aircraft during his career. By this point, he had just under 2,000 hours of experience on the 757. Sitting to his right was 34-year-old First Officer Aykut Gergen. With just 3,500 total flying hours, he was far less experienced than the captain. In fact, he had just 71 hours flying the 757. In a few short minutes, this gap in experience would play a crucial role in the development of a deadly situation. Sitting behind the pilots for the long journey was Relief Captain Mulhis Evrenezoglu. He was 51 years old and had built up 15,000 flying hours. However, he was very new to the 757, with just over 100 hours on the aircraft. He would be taking over from the captain at a later stage of the journey. The aircraft they were flying was an 11-year-old Boeing 757. The 757 was a modern aircraft in 1996, and it had an excellent safety record. However, this particular plane had been on the ground at Puerto Plata for the 20 days before the flight, and in that time, it had developed a critical weakness. As we're about to see though, it was not this weakness, but the flight crew's response to it, which would endanger the lives of all on board this flight. In fact, the pilots' actions would baffle investigators. Just seconds after takeoff, their response to a simple problem would turn their unusual situation into a desperate fight for survival. At just after 11:30 local time, Flight 301 pushed back from the gate at Puerto Plata, and the 176 passengers settled in for the long journey. As it was night time, the crew would have to rely entirely on their instruments to chart their course out north over the Atlantic. As advanced an aircraft as the Boeing 757 was, the most important instruments in the cockpit were still the most basic ones. These were the ADI, or Attitude Direction Indicator, which showed the pilots the plane's position relative to the horizon, as in whether the plane is pitching up or down, and whether it's turning left or right. Another important instrument was the altimeter, which told the pilots how high they were, and the airspeed indicator, which, as the name suggests, told the pilots their speed through the air. On this 757, each pilot also had a ground speed indicator. The importance of these instruments is about to become abundantly clear. Shortly before midnight, the captain lined the aircraft up on runway 08 at Puerto Plata and pushed the engines to take off thrust. When the plane reached 80 knots, or 150 km per hour, the first officer made the standard call-out of 80 knots. The purpose of this is for both pilots to check that their airspeed indicators display the same reading. The captain saw that his still read 0, and said, "My airspeed indicator is not working." Mismatching airspeed indications are a serious issue, and are grounds for aborting a takeoff. But, eager to get going with the flight, the captain decided to continue, as it appeared that the first officer's instrument was working. 120. Is yours working? Yes, sir. The captain then asked the first officer to tell him when to lift off based off of his own instrument.
V1. Rotate.
The captain lifted the plane into the air and began climbing out over the Atlantic Ocean. A few seconds after takeoff, as the aircraft climbed through 500 feet, the captain's airspeed indicator started to move, and he pointed this out to the first officer. As far as he was concerned, this was the end of whatever trouble that was during the takeoff. Everything was now back to normal, he believed. However, the captain had no idea that his airspeed indicator was in fact just as broken as it had been on the ground. The crucial difference was that now, it gave the appearance of being correct. Rather than reading 0, it was starting to give completely erroneous readings. For an aircraft, speed is the one critical thing. Go too slow, and the plane will fall out of the sky. Go too fast, and it will be torn apart by the force of the air. That's why there was a total of 5 entirely independent speed indications in this cockpit. The captain's wasn't working, but there was also the first officer's airspeed indicator, as well as a backup airspeed indicator, and 2 ground speed indicators. For that reason, the fact that the captain's instrument was not working shouldn't have been too big of a deal. But a few moments later, the crew got a warning.
Rudder ratio, Mach airspeed trim. There's something wrong here. There are some problems.
These warnings were strange. The rudder ratio warning told the pilots that the plane's rudder controls were too sensitive given how fast the plane was going. Just like in a car, it's okay to turn the steering wheel a lot when you're going slow. But when you're driving down a motorway at high speed, that same movement of the wheel would cause the car to spin out of control. The plane's computer thought that it was going very fast, and so cautioned the pilots against using too much rudder. Likewise, the Mach speed trim warning told the pilots that the horizontal stabilizer at the back of the aircraft was not set up correctly for high-speed flight. But the plane was not in high-speed flight. The computer just thought it was, because it was taking its speed readings from the captain's faulty airspeed indicator. The captain then noticed that his airspeed indicator was showing a ridiculously high reading. He pointed it out to the first officer.
Okay, there's something crazy. Do you see it? There is something crazy there. Right now, mine is only 200 and decreasing, sir.
The captain's airspeed indicator was showing a speed of around 300 knots, which was way too fast for this stage of the flight. On the other hand, the first officer's was showing a comparatively slow speed of just 200 knots. Which one was correct? This was a critical moment for the crew. Would they be able to determine that the captain's instrument was faulty? They had 3 other independent sources of speed available to them: the standby airspeed indicator and the 2 ground speed indicators. By checking each indication against the other, they would be able to see that the captain's was the only one which was different, and therefore that it had to be wrong. But incredibly, the pilots didn't do this. The captain immediately compared his instrument to the first officer's and concluded,
Both of them are wrong.
This statement from the captain set the stage for disaster. And, perhaps owing to his vast experience, this conclusion that both instruments were wrong went unchallenged by the other 2 crew members. Neither the first officer nor the relief captain compared the captain's airspeed indicator with each of the others. If they had done this, they would have seen that all of the other indicators showed a speed of about 200 knots. The captain only compounded this problem by offering up a possible explanation for the unusual warnings. He said that it was normal for there to be issues after a plane had been on the ground for a long while. In other words, the plane was just being a nuisance. Case closed. Rather than troubleshooting the issue with his crew and trying to identify a reliable source of airspeed, he simply brushed off the warnings as something to be expected. Nonetheless, the pilots had received training and had checklists for what to do in the case of unreliable airspeed indications. But they didn't follow these. In fact, they did something which was not called for at all. They decided to reset the circuit breakers responsible for the captain's airspeed indications. All while this was happening, the autopilot was flying the aircraft. And, crucially, it was taking its cues from the captain's faulty airspeed indicator. Because this indicator showed the plane as travelling extremely fast, the autopilot tried to reduce the aircraft's speed by pitching the nose up and reducing the engine power. But in reality, the plane wasn't travelling fast. In fact, the actions of the autopilot were bringing the plane ever closer to an aerodynamic stall, where the speed of the air over the wings would not be enough to keep it in the sky. The next few seconds would be critical. Would the crew notice what was happening to their aircraft before it was too late? The captain pointed out that the standby airspeed indicator was correct, and the first officer agreed that it was. By using it, the crew would be able to fly their aircraft perfectly normally. This makes what's about to happen even more puzzling. Shortly after this, the overspeed warning sounded in the cockpit. This is an urgent warning. It indicates that the plane is travelling so fast that it may break apart. Yet the crew correctly ignored it. They knew that the warning was being generated by the captain's faulty airspeed indicator. The captain ordered the relief captain to pull the circuit breaker for the overspeed warning, which caused it to stop. Behind the pilots, the passengers were all but oblivious to the drama unfolding in the cockpit. The plane appeared to be flying normally, and there was no sign that anything was amiss. They had no idea as their plane climbed out over the Atlantic Ocean that they were in grave danger. While the pilots had been pulling circuit breakers and misdiagnosing their problem, their aircraft had been getting slower and slower. Soon, it would reach a tipping point. And with their focus directed elsewhere in the cockpit, the pilots were utterly oblivious to the aircraft's predicament. Sure enough, a few moments after receiving the overspeed warning, both pilots' control columns started vibrating violently. This was the aircraft's way of warning them that it was about to stall and fall out of the sky. This completely blindsided the pilots. They hadn't been keeping an eye on the standby airspeed indicator, which they had previously identified as being correct. How could their aircraft be stalling? Without enough air moving over the wings, the plane began to drop. The relief captain sitting behind the pilots tried to draw the captain's attention to this by shouting,
ADI.
He wanted the captain to see what was happening to his aircraft. But the captain didn't heed this warning. He was utterly confused. His airspeed indications appeared not to be working. He had a max speed trim warning, a rudder ratio warning, an overspeed warning, and now the stick shaker was activated. What was going on with his plane? At this point, the pilots could have recovered the aircraft in a matter of seconds. All they needed to do was to point the nose down into the oncoming air and increase the power to the engines. This is the stall recovery procedure taught to all pilots very early on in their training, and it should be a reflex response to the stick shaker. But to carry out this procedure, the captain would first have to recognise that he was even in a stall. And in his state of confusion, he didn't do this. He simply had no idea what was happening to his aircraft. Had this taken place during the daytime, it would have been all too clear what was happening, as the captain would have seen the abnormally high pitch altitude out his windscreen. But in the dead of night, all he had was his ADI. Nonetheless, the two other pilots immediately recognised what was happening. The first officer urged the captain to push the nose of the aircraft down. Again, the relief captain shouted ADI, but still the captain didn't take heed of this. The plane had now lost 2,000 feet in altitude and was descending towards the sea at a dizzying rate. What follows is the actual cockpit voice recording from the flight. The intermittent rattling sound you hear in the background is the stick shaker. At 11:47 p.m. that night, still travelling at over 400 km per hour, Flight 301 impacted the ocean. All 189 people on board died instantly. An investigation was launched immediately after the crash by the Dominican Republic government's General Directorate of Civil Aviation. 3 weeks after the crash, when the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder were dredged up from the bottom of the ocean, a terrifying picture of confusion began to emerge. It immediately became clear to investigators that one simple problem with the aircraft, a faulty airspeed indicator, had snowballed into a full-blown catastrophe. The question investigators were faced with was why? Why did 3 trained pilots lose control of a perfectly flyable aircraft? Before we get to that, it's worth understanding why the captain's airspeed indications were faulty to begin with. At the start of the episode, I mentioned that the plane had been parked up at Puerto Plata for the 20 days before the accident. It's standard procedure while an aircraft is on the ground for an extended period of time for the pitot tubes to be covered. Pitot tubes are hollow metallic cylinders which stick out from the fuselage and are used to measure the plane's airspeed. The faster the plane goes, the more air gets pushed inside the cylinder. The aircraft interprets this increase in air pressure inside the tube as an increase in airspeed. There are 3 pitot tubes on the 757, as there are on all passenger jets. One for the captain, one for the first officer, and one backup. But for some period during this aircraft's stay on the ground, the pitot tubes were left uncovered. During this period, an insect made its way inside the captain's pitot tube and built its nest there. This blocked the pitot tube and prevented it from giving accurate readings to the captain. The pitot tubes were never recovered, so it's not possible to know this with certainty. However, these insects have been known to cause issues for pitot tubes before, and they are a recognised danger by pilots flying in the Dominican Republic. But even though this was the cause of the faulty airspeed readings, the final report cited it as only being a contributing cause of the accident. Ultimately, investigators determined that the cause of the accident was the pilot's failure to recognise that they had entered a stall, and their failure to recover control of the aircraft once it had stalled. Contributing to this was the fact that, shockingly, Birgenair's pilot training did not include any instruction in crew resource management, or teamwork in the cockpit. This meant that when the crew first came up against the abnormal speed readings, their troubleshooting of the issue was wholly ineffective. There were 3 pilots on board. At least one of them should have been keeping an eye on the plane's speed and its pitch attitude. Instead, all 3 pilots became hopelessly focused on the circuit breakers and the warnings on their central display. There was no systematic use of the crew's skills to solve the problem, and as such, none of the crew recognised the aircraft's enormous pitch-up attitude and its decreasing airspeed. Had they noticed this, they would have recognised that a stall was imminent, and they would have been able to take action to prevent it. The final report also noted that there was a complete breakdown in procedural discipline, meaning that none of the crew followed the procedures they had been trained to carry out, which included the procedures for unreliable airspeed indications and the stall recovery procedures. However, even without following checklists, the pilots should still have been able to fly the aircraft. The fact that they didn't make use of all 5 speed indications in the cockpit suggested that they lacked sufficient knowledge of their aircraft systems. For something as basic as airspeed, this does not just come with experience. Adequate training and performance evaluation should ensure the pilots are completely familiar with these fundamental parts of their plane's operation. On this note, the investigation made the point that the pilots had received their training in piecemeal fashion. Some of it was from United Airlines Flight Academy, while other parts of it were from Pan Am International Flight Academy, among some others. Because of this, they didn't have a cohesive training program which fit the kind of flying that Birgenair did. As a result of the investigation, a number of recommendations were made to ensure that an accident like this would never happen again. These included that all airlines must include crew resource management in their training program. The report also recommended that all training in Boeing 757s include a scenario flight in the simulator where pilots are trained to respond to the effects of a blocked pitot tube. Unfortunately, just a few months after this accident, another 757 crashed after takeoff from Peru under eerily similar circumstances. I've covered that accident here on the channel. You can see it by clicking at the link on the top right of your screen. To this day, Flight 301 is the worst crash involving a 757 in terms of passenger fatalities, matched only by American Flight 77, which was hijacked and crashed into the Pentagon in Washington DC on September 11th. Above all, Flight 301 shows how unforgiving flying can be. Small problems, if dealt with incorrectly, can snowball into a full-blown disaster. Nowadays, incidents like this are far less common, mainly due not to advancements in technology, but to improvements in pilot training, and specifically in crew resource management. I'd like to thank the Patreon and YouTube members for helping to make this video possible. If you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting the channel for as little as €3 per month. I've put the links for that on the screen here. I'd especially like to thank Joey and Steve Wilcox for their very generous support. Green Dot Aviation now has a Discord server, so if you'd like to join a growing community of people discussing all things aviation, just tap on the link in the video description and I'll see you there. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you soon for the next episode.